I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. One of the unofficial pillars of original Dungeons and Dragons, long before they even had pillars, is combat. The term roleplay games hadn't really even been invented. It was thought of in different aspects, as I talked about in prior videos, but it wasn't applied to this game. It was seen as a miniature war game type of thing with, characters, levels, some personality, and that type of stuff. Anyways, in this, they kind of were trying to find their home with what type of combat system they were going to use. In other games that they played, there was several different types. In this particular video, we're going to talk about what I'm calling mass combat rules. Okay, so what mass combat rule is, you have a token, you have something, a dice, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's going to count as 20 soldiers. So you can have an army of troops. It might be 5 soldiers per thing. It might be 100 soldiers per thing. Each thing might be a battalion. That's going to be for the larger scale combat. You're going to have heroes in there, and they're going to be effective and dangerous and fierce and all those things. And you're going to have fantasy creatures because that's what makes it a fantasy war game or game. But you're not going to be doing like individual combat. That is man to man. And the fantasy combat is similar to man, but a little bit different. And then the funny thing is there's actually a fourth style, which is actually inside the original Dungeons and Dragons core books, I'm calling it, the original 3, the Min and Magic books. And that is called Attack Matrix. The Attack Matrix ended up being called THACA, which ended up being the main rule system for many years. That got adjusted later, got turned into the D20 system, which that became a whole thing by itself. And now we have Ascending Armor Class in 5th edition and from 3rd edition to 5th. And that is literally where it's gone. So in the official alternate dice system for attacking ended up being the winner. The reason why it was not in the original rules as the primary thing is they didn't have D20s back then. You had D20s, but it was to 10 twice. So you didn't know which one was which. So it was a little bit different. They didn't have that type of thing. But it was an alternate type of D10, shall we say. It was just 2 different D10s. So mass combat rules, where would you find these? Well, I went looking for these things, and it was a little bit hard to find initially. Of course, it's in the Chainmail rulebook, but this is a different system. It's not even D&D. It's Chainmail. It's a war game. It's not even a role-play game or anything of that nature. You don't have characters in there. I mean, you technically could if you were playing a hero, but that's different. That's not exactly you. That's just your general or lieutenant or something. So since combat was one of the core elements, I figured it'd be all over the place. You'd have this stuff everywhere. When I looked inside the first book, Min and Magic, there was only 6 references to combat, which I found a little bit bizarre. And none of them were really on point. One just talked about the alternate combat system, and it moved on. But this is why I like the PDFs, because I'm able to go through and kind of search these things and really dig down deeper and find things that maybe I wouldn't have known without going into it more. Book 1 does have a lot of terminology, though, which if you don't know what mass combat is and you're looking for it that way, would be hard to spot, but it's there. For example, it talks about men, a fighting man, that type of thing. So how many men you were was a thing that was in Chainmail, but when they went to D&D, when they added levels, that was what they did. Also, back when they were using mass combat, you didn't really have hit points. It was binary. It was a hit equals death. Now, if you're 2 men, because you're 2 hit dice, then guess what? You can be hit twice versus once and killed. But if you're first level, you'd be hit once and killed. Now, fighters are 1 + 1. Now, what I always treated that +1 for was that was like a save. So you'd roll, you get hit, you take out the last one, you roll a d6. If you rolled a 1 and 6, then boom, you didn't die. You're just at basically 1 hit point. You're very badly off, and the next hit's guaranteed to kill you. You only get 1 of those saves, and it's your last roll. So you might roll a 2, you may not get it, and you die. So it's got a lot of tension in there, even if. But having a +3, like if you're 6 + 3 as a troll, then you could do a d6 roll, roll a 1, 2, or 3, and you're fine. Otherwise, if you're a troll, you just roll a d6 and you roll a 4, you die. Okay? So that makes a lot of sense, I think, in that way, and gives a little bit of a benefit to the more martial classes, which tend to have more bonuses than others. So in Book 2, in the Monsters and Treasures, they introduced normal men and men type. So men type would be like goblins and orcs and those type of things. They're not technically menfolk or folk, really, as I would prefer to call them. But they are men-like. They are basically equivalent to a man. It might be a 1 hit dice -1, for example, because it's a weak creature. But it follows the same type of thing. It's not on the fantasy scale, because it's technically qualifies as man in some regard. Some things, though, when you're using the mass combat system, and you're not using the fantasy system, like trolls, will count as 6 + 3 men. So they count as 6 men, and then on one of the dice of their choice, they get to add +3, which means they hit more often. And every time they hit, that is a man who dies. If you're a 2 hit dice creature or 2 men, then and you take 2 hits, then you die. If you have 5 people there, all 2 hit dice, and he does 3 wounds, well, guess what? He kills 1.5 people, which means that goes to a person having a hit dice left to be able to survive one more attack, potentially, unless they make their saves. And if they both make their saves, or one makes their save and the other one takes a hit, guess what? They both survive for one more round, unless they get hit again. Where we start to actually get into a little bit of the mass combat rule system is in Book 3, though. That is the the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures book. It's not perfectly clear, but it does reference external games. Games like Don't Give Up the Ship, Battle in the Skies, or BITS as they like to call it, and then Fight in the Skies, and of course Chainmail. So the naval ships, the naval battle ones are actually for naval combat. And then you have the aircraft ones, and that's actually for aerial combat. And then, of course, chainmails for land combat. And all these are a larger section than what the actual mass combat or any combat system in the actual 3 core books. You had to go outside of the core books to get that. Now, chainmail was not exactly cheap for back then, so to have to go buy a different game so you could be able to play the game you wanted to play is a bit much. And that's part of the reason why everyone basically played a different version of Dungeons & Dragons, because they only knew some of the rules, or they witnessed this one thing and that makes sense, or they've seen chainmail played but they can't remember it all and they don't have it memorized and this type of stuff. So it kind of became a little bit difficult to be able to follow along with that type of stuff, which is part of the reason for the game. But let's be clear too. While they're writing this, they're trying to fit pages, a certain amount of stuff in the same amount of pages, which means they really could have benefited from an editor, and they really could have benefited maybe from a little bit more capital you put into it, so they could have made the book they wanted to make versus make the book they were able to make. And a lot of new businesses find themselves, and they were very unproven, and I don't hold it against them at all. They got Timcast as soon as they could, and they made great improvements up to like the first supplement. It literally was just that quickly. So, and they're that much better because of those supplements. Anyways, on page 25 of the 3rd book, you're going to start seeing some stuff. And as you can see by the slides that are going by, there's a lot of things that are going on here. Some of the reasons why there is some bulk and whatnot on this is they were cutting the fat off of all these other games as they basically moved them into Dungeons and Dragons. And some of that stuff still remained, and some of it was a little bit awkward. But for the most part, they really did refine those down to the good parts of the game and then put it into their game. I really feel like this is worth repeating. The game designers, Mr. Gygax and Mr. Arneson, felt that there was a better version of the game. Their game was brilliant. However, as Gary Gygax made AD&D, I think he got more of the game he wanted to have. As Arneson left and he was kind of limited by legal and this type of stuff of what he was able to do, I think he found a better game that he enjoyed too. In the end, I think they both made great games quicker because of the initial start. Literally, they were pumping out stuff so quickly, and at the same time, that stuff like the Strategic Review, Dragon magazines, the revised edition of old D&D, original D&D, and then first edition, which is all basically coming out within the same years, really show how much the game was changing and how much this was sort of like an initial playtest, and so much of the players' input was used when they made the game. I wish we could see stuff like that now, because I could imagine how the game would be better or more personalized for the different groups of people. But I think it would kind of split groups up and make them into very niche groups, kind of like what you have with the edition wars, shall we say. So Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and a lot of the early players of the game all had the same type of thought. They wanted to play like a war game, but they wanted to play a character from like the Grey Mouser series. They wanted to play Conan the Barbarian. They wanted to play the evil sorcerer or warlock that was inside a tower. They wanted to have that. So when you look at the game, you look at what drives the characters and where they put XP and rewards, you're going to find a lot of it in that place. You're going to find lords, you're going to find barons, you're going to find thief guilds and this type of stuff. Though they didn't actually have thieves in the original core 3 books, it was very quickly added because another group of gamers in California, if I'm not mistaken, actually wrote to Gygax and talked to Gygax, and they came up with the thief class. Now, I think they were kind of in the thief class already, but they kind of circled it in and made it really what it is, and they're credited with it. A lot of war game stuff, though, still existed. There was a lot of war game-like mechanics that were still in the game. Things like they wanted you to plan out what you're going to do and give orders to your guys, essentially. They wanted you to use a measuring stick to be able to measure things, and so you could move your guys. They wanted to keep things a little bit secret in that way. Like you wouldn't know what level or character was, because you'd have to be like, okay, so they cast a magic missile and they only had one missile. So are they, 4th level? Are they 3rd level? What do we know about magic missile? Are they 5th level? What 5th level do they get? And you'd have to figure that out to know how terrifying or easy that particular person was. And if they were good or evil or law or chaotic, then you might be making some sort of plot and plan against things. There was a lot of fog of war that was purposely added to the game to create that tension in the game that I feel like they felt was good. Also, what a weird way to say it, but if you were within 3 inches of an enemy, you were considered a melee combat. That's kind of a weird thing to say. The table that you played on was supposed to be very specific distances so that you could have enough movement to get around the table and to position yourself. They didn't want too small of a space, essentially. Now, that's not a hard, fast rule, but that was kind of what the suggestion was. So another thing that was very warlike and mechanic and that type of stuff was how hit dice were resolved in mass combat. It was binary. If you hit, that equals death. If you miss, that equals life, because you weren't taking the damage. So that really did depend on it. Your unit of 20 guys all being worth 1 HDPs or 1 hit dice meant that you could take 20 wounds before the unit was completely annihilated. Now, you probably would fail a morale save before that, and it very specifically says that PCs do not suffer morale saves. However, the unit around you might. And if you're stuck fighting a unit by yourself, you're probably dead either way. So it'd probably be best for you to run with your unit versus staying there to try and fight them all. Personally, I feel like the mass combat rules are only good in larger games where you have several characters to maintain and this type of stuff. Doing that for your main character, only having a hit dice versus a hit point where you could have a low roll and you survive and this type of stuff, I feel like is too simplified for my style of play. If I'm playing a guy who's in charge of a unit and it's unit versus unit or units versus units, that makes a lot more sense to me. When we get to mano a mano, general versus general, though, I would like to rotate that out to a different combat system where we actually consider hit points and whatnot. And I could see that as a thing. So I took 2 hits, or I'd be considered down 2 hit dice because of all that. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce my hit points by that amount because I've already sustained some damage because of whatever went on. That makes a lot of sense to me. However, I also see the benefit of keeping things simple with hit dice when it comes to things like henchmen. So you have a torchbearer. He's a 1 hit dice creature. He gets hit. He's a fighter, so he gets a D6, 1 in 6 chance to survive. No problem. Otherwise, he dies. Why? Because he's a henchman. He's not part of the story. We need to move on. I might have several henchmen. You might be in a caravan with like 15, 20 henchmen. You don't want to necessarily have individual hit points for every single one of them. That doesn't make sense. That sounds like a whole lot of work and things to track as you're going. I think understanding the scale of which the battle you're doing is very important. As you can tell by the slides that have gone by in the last little bit here, Book 3 has way more information about aerial and naval combat than it does about land combat. It's a very short thing. But in there, it kind of sounds like it is referring to the chainmail mass combat, because it refers to it as one man or creature. Okay, it's referring to maybe like the fantasy supplement being used with D&D, because it says one man or creature. Creature doesn't sound like an orc. Creature sounds like a griffin or a troll or a giant, something that would be on the fantasy table versus being on the mass combat table. So I really do kind of see them wanting you to use multiple systems. Man-to-man when you're doing small scale stuff, mass combat when you're in a large group, and fantasy when you're over here doing stuff against magical creatures that are mystical and this type of stuff. So mass combat states that you roll a certain number of 6-sided dice for every man in the unit. The number of dice is based upon what type of attacker you are versus what type of defender they are. Now, this can be a little bit complicated. This is kind of based off of like a tier-based system. There's 3 different types of foot troops and 3 different types of mounted troops, and they're not equal. Mounted troops tend to have the advantage on this type of stuff in most situations. The situations where they win is when you're like holding for charge and you have a pike or some sort of long spear. Because there's a hierarchy for these type of things, let's just go ahead and go through them real quick. There's light, heavy, and armored. Armored being the best, light being the fastest, probably more like archers, casters, wizards, this type of stuff. Then for mounted troops, you have light, medium, and heavy. Now, again, I wish they were sort of the same, but I understand why they didn't. So I'm not going to really go into too much about how melee weapons functions and this type of stuff and things like weapon class and all that. I'm going to be doing videos specifically talking about weapons themselves and a lot of their functionality and how they're used and like the weapon class system and how that's used. So I'm not going to go into that really here. Let's just say that rolling high in your D6s is good. 6s are always a hit, and hits equal death if you remember. However, how many dice you roll really does make a difference. If you are a Lightfoot attacking a heavy mounted, so you are the absolute extremes, you get 1 attack for every 4 Lightfoot you have against the heavy mounted. If you have 6 guys, you're only getting 1 dude. If you have 8, you get 2 attacks. You need 6s to hit. So that's terrible. You have a 1 or 2 in 6 chance of probably getting a 6. You're probably not going to roll boxcars, but you might get a hit. If you have just 2 heavy cavalry going against 6 light troops, you're going to get 4 dice per cavalry member, heavy cavalry, and you need 5s or 6s. Oof, that is brutal. If you have any sort of bonuses, like a +1, then you get to add that dice to that. That's incredible. That is pretty much guaranteed death for a lot of things. Basically, high dice rules the day. High number of attacks rules the day. And this can get very swingy quickly. This is where tactics come into play. This is not just running your checkers across the board, matching them up, jumping over each other, and moving on. Whether you have the flank, you have the rear, you're charging in your cavalry, you cause fear or terror because you're some sort of fantasy creature like a dragon, all these things matter. If you are the person who wants a good matchup because then at least it's more fair, then that makes sense too, but you certainly don't want to be mismatched and be weaker than your opponent, having your bowman get charged by a cavalry unit that swung around the outside, for example. That's a bad day for you. However, if you are balanced and you're fighting that middle ground where you both need 5s or 6s and you have about the same number of dice and everything's about the same, little things make a difference. Things like being higher ground, being the one to get the charge, being in the flank, those type of things, like I said, are going to be where you end up winning. Having spears and having an extra rank to attack, for example. Now, combat goes beyond that. It goes into morale. I talked about earlier, PCs don't fail morale saves, NPCs do. So if you have in mass combat the unit to flee, the type of troop you are does affect your morale in that way. And I won't go into morale in this video. That is a completely long 15-20 minute video by itself. If you want to watch and learn more about chainmail and how all that works, I literally have a video out that talks a lot about chainmail, and it's a very long video that would be really good for you to get a good footwork and understanding of this game. So let's go ahead and pause right here and talk about something I feel like that would allow you to shift the focus to what I'm talking about with it being swingy. Let's just say that you have a bunch of peasants running around, and then joining them, you have a knight on horseback. Very much could be a thing that actually occurs. Militia with a knight. Very easily could be you on top of a horse. Let's say you're level 8. Okay? So you now count as a heavy mounted person, man. You're level 8, which means you have 8 men for your type. And because you're heavy mounted, going against, let's say, more militia, so light foot, you're going to have 4 times 8 or 32 attacks, needing 5s or 6s. Let's just say you're an elf and you're using a sword and you get a +1 in there. Ooh, uh-oh, look out. You got a magic weapon? Uh-oh, look out. What's going on here? That is when it gets very swingy. That's when it gets very ridiculous. That is when the true power of your lord, your hero, your character, the thing you work so hard for, actually starts to pay dividends, and why superheroes are so terrifying on the battlefield in a chainmail game. And like I said, any bonuses you might be getting, whether it's a +1 because of hit dice, or a +3 because you're a troll, or a magic weapon, or an elf using a bow or a long sword, you get that to one of your dice, and that helps you get at least one more hit. Also, if you happen to be a dwarf fighting a giant, you only take half damage. You suffer half the kills. So if he gets 3 hits, then guess what? You only take 1 wound. That's pretty incredible. I think what this game has done is it has shifted with mass combat what they perceive to be the important parts of combat, this historical nature, the complications of tactics, the different uses of weapons, having different layers and different strategies, maybe on purpose fleeing to move a unit out of position so you can get a nice flank charge, the prediction of what they're going to do versus what they actually do. All these things made the game more complicated than when you look at it. Where people, I feel like, struggle is they look at all the what they call bloat, or the bogging down, or they're trying to figure out the rules. And what that actually is they're conflating the different types of combat systems, which is why I'm making videos very early in my series here talking about the different types of combat systems there are in original Dungeons & Dragons, because there's literally 4. And if you start including things like the supplement 1 where they have hit locations, it grows beyond that. Okay, so we're going to try and break through this a little bit and get people using a single system within a combat, and then knowing when they should shift to the other ones. But things like initiative and mass combat aren't a thing. Everyone goes Simo, everyone goes at the same time. You both do your hits, and then you pull your wounds after combat. There's an order to it. It's very procedural, that type of stuff. Don't try and conflate what Man to Man is or what modern day D&D is to this game. It works the way it is. Once you get to know it and once you understand it, then you can go and make some small changes. But you probably don't want to make any changes until you play it. The game does work pretty well as it is. Anyways, I would change what you feel like you need to change to make it fit your group's game style. Maybe you never use mass combat because you never have that many troops. Maybe use mass combat for your henchmen, and when they take a hit, they just take a die. So they die. So for example, if you're doing the alternate dice system and you wanted to have a hit equals death, that's what it is. They roll a d20, they hit the armor class, that character dies. You don't even have to roll hit points, you just move on. That is merging the official alternate combat system with the mass combat, making it more efficient because that thing doesn't matter. It's not the main character. But save your alternate combat system with hit points for your main characters because that's more fun, frankly. Anyways, guys, you want to see more videos like this, you want to see some other videos like this, please like the video right down below in the comments so I know what aspects you're wanting to do. If I've got a plan for it already, I'll let you know. And if I don't, then when I put the video, I will go ahead and give you a shout out. Love to hear from you guys. Keep having a great day and roll those dice. Bye.